A dirty cop picks the wrong woman in federal court. 4 seconds later, he's unconscious on the marble floor. And he has no idea how much worse it's about to get. You think that badge means anything to me out here? Sweetheart, in here, I am the law. Officer Derek Holloway's fingers dug into the woman's forearm hard enough to leave marks. Take your hand off me. That is your only warning. Elena Cross said, her voice flat as still water. Holloway laughed the kind of laugh that had never once been challenged. Or what you gonna cry about it, he shoved her. It was the last decision he'd ever make as a free man wearing that uniform. The Ashford County Federal Courthouse rose out of downtown Denver like a granite fortress. Its columned facade designed a century ago to remind every citizen who walked through its doors exactly how small they were in the machinery of justice. Inside, the halls smelled of floor wax and old paper, and every footstep on the polished stone floors seemed to announce itself to the entire building. For most people, the courthouse was intimidating. For Officer Derek Holloway, it was home turf. He was 6'4", built like a rugby prop who'd swapped his training regimen for a diet of gas station burritos and unchecked ego. And he had spent 9 years on the Denver force, cultivating a reputation that struck fear into anyone unfortunate enough to end up on the wrong side of his temper. He wasn't the officer people called when they needed help. He was the officer people prayed they'd never encounter. His personnel file the parts that hadn't mysteriously vanished, told a story of excessive force complaints, harassment allegations, and evidence that had a peculiar habit of going missing right before it mattered. And every single time, the union closed ranks around him like a fortress wall. This particular Thursday morning, Holloway sat in Courtroom 6A, waiting to testify in a traffic stop that had somehow ballooned into a resisting arrest charge. 5 weeks earlier, he'd pulled a driver over on the Lakeshore Expressway for no reason, beyond the fact that her vehicle, a matte olive green pickup truck, immaculately kept, had caught his eye, and he'd been in a foul mood. He expected some frightened office worker who'd wilt the moment he raised his voice. Instead, he'd pulled over Elena Cross. She sat now on the hard bench of Courtroom 6A, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, dressed in a tailored deep burgundy suit that radiated understated competence. Her dark hair was twisted into a simple, practical knot. To a casual observer, she looked like a mid-level compliance officer, perhaps a paralegal on her lunch break. Utterly unremarkable. She was anything but. Before her current life, Elena had spent 8 years as a combatives instructor with the Diplomatic Security Service, training federal personnel in close-quarters defense, disarmament, and most critically, how to stay ice-cold when adrenaline flooded a room. She didn't just know how to fight, she understood, with clinical precision, exactly how a human body failed, under pressure. These days she ran a boutique corporate security consultancy that quietly did work for institutions who valued discretion above all else. Holloway had no idea any of this existed behind her calm brown eyes. He remembered only the night on the expressway how he'd ordered her out of the truck for erratic driving. A complete fiction. And how her calm request for his badge number had detonated something ugly in him. He'd grabbed her, thrown her against the hood, and cuffed her, charging her with resisting an arrest that had never needed to happen. She hadn't fought. She hadn't screamed. She'd simply let him build the case against himself, watching him with the patient stillness of a predator, letting a careless animal wander deeper into a trap. Now, in the courtroom, his testimony was falling apart in real time. Elena's attorney, a sharp public defender she'd retained purely to preserve her cover, had spent 20 minutes unraveling his timeline. The dashcam footage from his cruiser had been corrupted, a fact that made the judge's eyebrows climb. Judge Miriam Castellano pinched the bridge of her nose. Officer Holloway, your account is inconsistent, and the absence of any corroborating footage is troubling. We'll take a 15-minute recess. I strongly suggest you review your notes before we resume. The gavel cracked. The courtroom began to empty. Elena rose without a flicker of expression and walked out into the wide, echoing hallway. Holloway watched her go, fury climbing his throat like bile. He could not let a civilian, a woman, make him look like a fool in front of a federal judge. He needed to reassert control. He shoved through the courtroom doors and followed her. The second-floor corridor was bathed in the flat, sterile glow of overhead lighting, reflecting off marble, the color of old bone. Normally, these halls buzzed with attorneys negotiating, defendants pacing, clerks hauling files. But on this stretch, at this hour, the corridor had gone strangely quiet. Just a maintenance worker, pushing a cart near the far stairwell. Elena stood near a tall arched window overlooking the plaza below, a paper cup of water in hand, methodically running the day's proceedings through her mind. She already knew how this would end. She was simply letting the machine grind forward before she pulled the lever herself. Heavy footsteps broke the silence, uneven, aggressive, unmistakably Holloway's. She didn't turn around. "Think you're pretty clever." "Huh." His voice was a low growl. She took a slow sip of water. "I think, Officer Holloway, that the truth is difficult to manipulate when you lack the imagination to construct a convincing lie." A vein pulsed in his neck. He closed the distance, invading her space, using his size to block the light from the window and cast a shadow over her. The stale smell of vending machine coffee clung to him. "Listen to me, you smug." He leaned in close, voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You got lucky in there with that senile judge. But this doesn't end in a courtroom. You made me look bad. I don't forget that. I own these streets. I can make every day of your life miserable until you're begging me to stop." Elena turned to face him fully. There was no fear in her expression, only something that looked disturbingly like pity, which enraged him further. "Are you threatening a witness outside a federal courtroom?" "Officer, that's a felony." "It's not a threat. It's a promise." His hand drifted toward the baton on his belt. Her eyes flicked to his hand, then back to his face. "Step back. You are violating my personal space. And you are operating under a serious misunderstanding of your own authority." Something in him snapped. He couldn't process her total lack of submission. He needed her to flinch, to cower, to prove his dominance was real. In a burst of uncontrolled rage, he reached for her collar, intending to slam her against the window frame the way he had slammed countless others in dim alleyways. "I'll show you who's in control." He shoved her shoulder hard, trying to unbalance her before the grab. That was the spark for Elena Cross. The world didn't accelerate. It slowed, the way it always did when her training took over. The civilian mask fell away instantly, replaced by something lethal and precise. Holloway expected her to stumble, to gasp, to be swallowed by his weight advantage. Instead, she absorbed the shove like water flowing around a rock. As his hand surged toward her collar, his balance tipped forward onto his lead foot, sloppy, emotional, undisciplined. Her response took less than a second. Her left hand swept up, catching his wrist, redirecting his momentum past her, rather than resisting it. She pivoted sharply off the line of the attack. Holloway, carried by his own force, stumbled into the space where she'd been a heartbeat before he could reorient. She struck an open palm blow driven into the nerve cluster at the side of his neck, just above the collarbone. Not brute force. Precision. It was like grounding a live wire. His right arm went instantly numb, dropping useless to his side. A wave of dizziness crashed through him. He gasped, his brain scrambling to process the failure. She wasn't finished. A wounded threat was still a threat. She seized the fabric at his shoulder with one hand, hooked his belt with the other, dropped her hips beneath his center of gravity, and executed a clean hip throw with textbook efficiency, lifting 230 pounds of stunned police officer off the ground as though he weighed nothing. For one surreal second, Derek Holloway was airborne. Then the marble met him. The impact cracked through the corridor like a gunshot. Air blasted from his lungs. His skull struck the floor hard enough to rattle the window panes, but not hard enough to fracture bone, just enough to short-circuit whatever passed for judgment in him. His eyes rolled back. His limbs twitched once. Then still. 3.6 seconds. Start to finish. The maintenance worker down the hall dropped his mop. Elena rose calmly, smoothed a wrinkle from her burgundy jacket. Her breathing hadn't changed. Her pulse had barely moved. She looked down at him. "I warned you," she said quietly. Then she pulled out her phone and dialed for an ambulance. Chaos hit the building within 70 seconds. The sound of Holloway's fall had reached the bailiffs in the neighboring courtrooms, and soon armed officers were pouring into the hallway, hands hovering near their weapons. What they found stopped them cold. Derek Holloway, the department's most feared officer, lay flat on his back, blood trickling from his nose, snoring faintly. Standing over him, calm as someone waiting for a bus, was Elena Cross. "Get on the ground, hands where I can see them," a young court officer barked, his taser trembling in his grip. Elena didn't argue. She set her water cup on the windowsill, raised her hands, and knelt, fingers laced behind her head. She knew procedure better than half the rookies in the room. "I'm unarmed." The officer initiated the assault. "I acted in self-defense," she said clearly. They cuffed her anyway, dragging her arms back roughly. Meanwhile, paramedics sprinted toward Holloway with a gurney and smelling salts. He groaned awake, vision swimming, and when it cleared enough to make out Elena in handcuffs, his wounded pride roared back to life. She attacked me," he rasped, pointing a shaking finger. "Unprovoked. I was walking past. She jumped me. That's attempted murder on an officer." The officers restraining Elena tightened their grip, glaring at her with open contempt. "You're looking at a very long sentence, lady," one of them muttered, shoving her forward. She was marched down to the holding cells beneath the courthouse cold concrete. The smell of bleach and despair denied her phone call as a matter of unofficial policy. Hours passed. The chill sank into her bones, but her mind stayed clear, running through the legal terrain ahead, like a chessboard. Upstairs, Holloway was treated for a mild concussion and severe bruising. A detective from his precinct, Rowan Blake, cut from the same cloth, arrived to take his statement. Holloway spun an elaborate fiction. Elena had been erratic, had screamed obscenities, had lunged at him with combat training, had gone for his weapon. He'd merely tried to subdue her without lethal force, which was why he'd been hurt. Detective Blake wrote it all down without blinking. "Don't worry, Derek. We're throwing the book at her. Assault on an officer. Resisting arrest. The works. Judge Castellano won't grant bail. She's finished." Holloway smiled through a bruised jaw. "Make sure she suffers. Rovan. Make her regret ever getting out of that truck." What neither of them knew was that the real evidence was already secure, far beyond their reach. That night, discharged with painkillers and a neck brace he wore purely for effect, Holloway returned to the courthouse. There was one loose thread. Security cameras lined that hallway. And while he was confident his word would carry more weight than hers in any room, he couldn't risk footage surfacing that showed him shoving her first. Using his badge and a flimsy excuse about reviewing the scene, he talked his way into the security office. The night guard, a nervous 20-something intimidated by the uniform, handed over the console without a fight. Holloway found the timestamp, deleted the 10-minute window around the incident, and scrubbed the access log behind him. He walked out into the cold Denver night, feeling untouchable. The footage was gone. His story was locked in. Elena Cross was sitting in a cell staring down decades. He had won. The next morning, Elena was brought up for arraignment. Word had already spread. The woman who'd allegedly put a decorated officer in the hospital. The gallery was packed. The mood openly hostile. Prosecutor Samuel Whitlow looked like a man about to make an example out of somebody. Judge Castellano sat grim-faced behind the bench. Elena Cross, you are charged with aggravated assault on a police officer. How do you plead? Not guilty. Your Honor, Elena said, her voice steady in the tense silence. Whitlow rose. The state requests bail be denied. The defendant carried out a trained, vicious, unprovoked attack that hospitalized an officer. She presents a clear danger to law enforcement and the public. Judge Castellano turned toward the defense table. Counsel, your response. Elena's public defender wasn't there. Instead, the heavy doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open, and a man in a precisely tailored charcoal suit strode in, carrying a slim leather case, radiating quiet, absolute authority. My apologies for the delay. Your Honor, Nathaniel Ashworth, appearing for Ms. Cross. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ashworth wasn't a local defense attorney. He was a senior director with the Federal Office of Professional Integrity, the agency that corrupt departments quietly feared more than any internal affairs division. Prosecutor Whitlow went pale. In the gallery, still wearing his ridiculous neck brace, Holloway felt something cold twist in his stomach. Mr. Ashworth, Judge Castellano said, raising an eyebrow. This is an unusual appearance for OPI. It's an unusual case. Your Honor, Ashworth opened his case. First, I'm submitting documentation to the court. Elena Cross is not simply a civilian. She is an independent contractor operating as a field auditor for the Federal Interagency Corruption Task Force. The room erupted into whispers. Holloway's knuckles went white on the bench in front of him. For the past 7 months, Ashworth continued over the noise. My client has been conducting an undercover assessment of the 9th Precinct, specifically investigating a pattern of evidence tampering, perjury, and civil rights violations. Officer Derek Holloway has been the primary subject of that investigation. The silence that followed was total. You could have heard a pin drop 3 floors down. Holloway sat frozen, the color draining from his face. The predator had just discovered he was the bait. Judge Castellano leaned forward, eyes narrowing. These are extraordinarily serious allegations. Mr. Ashworth, do you have evidence? I do. Your Honor. He produced a small black flash drive, and I have evidence regarding yesterday's incident specifically. The state's version relies on Officer Holloway's report of an unprovoked attack. We reviewed the courthouse security footage. Whitlow stammered. The footage from that hallway is missing. Apparently corrupted. It wasn't corrupted, Ashworth said sharply. It was deliberately deleted last night at 9:15 p.m. by Officer Holloway himself, who accessed the security office without authorization. He was unaware that the federal backup server mirrors the courthouse's local system independently. Holloway sank in his seat as the walls closed in around him. Furthermore, Ashworth continued, as part of her undercover mandate, Ms. Cross was authorized to wear a discreet audio-visual recording device. He held up a small button that had been clipped, unnoticed, to the lapel of her burgundy jacket. I request permission to play the full recording. Judge Castellano's jaw tightened. Granted. Bailiff. Set up the monitor. A screen was wheeled forward. The room held its collective breath. The footage rolled a crisp, high-definition point-of-view shot from Elena's lapel. Holloway's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers. Thick with menace. Think you're pretty clever. Huh? Out here, you're just a civilian. In here, I am the law. The gallery watched him crowd her, heard the threats in full, watched him reach for her collar and shove her first. Then the frame blurred into motion, capturing the crack of the strike to his neck and the bone-deep thud of his body hitting marble. The video ended on a static shot of him lying unconscious on the floor. Nobody spoke. Prosecutor Whitlow closed his file slowly. Looking physically ill, he'd just realized he had been used to prosecute a federal agent who'd been assaulted by a dirty cop. Judge Castellano's expression hardened into something cold and merciless. She turned her gaze on the gallery and found Holloway directly. "Officer Holloway, stand up." He rose on shaking legs. "This court has just witnessed perjury, evidence tampering, and the assault of a federal auditor on courthouse property." She turned to the prosecutor. "All charges against Miss Cross are dismissed. With prejudice." Elena, still standing quietly at the defense table, offered a single, composed nod. "Furthermore," Judge Castellano continued, pointing at Holloway with a trembling finger, "Bailiff, place Officer Holloway under arrest. He is to be held without bail, pending charges of perjury, assault under color of law, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice." Two federal marshals who had entered quietly during the video presentation stepped forward and cuffed him the same rough grip he'd once used on strangers. "You have the right to remain silent." One of them said, "I'd strongly suggest you finally use it." Holloway's downfall was fast, brutal, and thoroughly public. Local news outlets couldn't get enough of the story. The untouchable cop who picked a fight with a civilian woman was unconscious in under 4 seconds and turned out to be the target of a sweeping federal corruption sting. The investigation, powered by Elena's meticulous documentation, tore the 9th Precinct apart. Detective Blake and 4 other officers were indicted alongside him. The union officials who had spent years shielding them suddenly found themselves facing racketeering charges of their own. 7 months later, the final gavel fell in federal court. Derek Holloway stripped of his badge, his pension, and every last shred of arrogance, stood before a different judge in an orange jumpsuit that clashed badly with his ashen face. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. No early parole. As a disgraced officer, his time inside would not be easy. The reckoning he'd built over 9 years of unchecked cruelty finally landed with the same precision as a well-executed throw. On the day of his sentencing, Elena Cross wasn't in the courtroom to watch. She was 2 states away, sitting in a quiet diner booth, reviewing a fresh case file on a corrupt sheriff's department. A cup of green tea cooling beside her papers. She was the kind of correction a broken system rarely saw coming. Men like Holloway always believed themselves untouchable, protected by a badge and their own myths of invincibility. But Elena knew better. Gravity comes for everyone eventually. Sometimes it just needs a little push. Wow, what a story of instant karma. Derek Holloway thought his badge made him invincible. But he picked the absolute wrong woman to threaten in that hallway. Arrogance never makes you untouchable, especially when you cross someone who knows exactly how to defend herself, and exactly how the law works. If you loved watching this corrupt officer get exactly what he deserved, physically and legally, smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story of justice finally catching up. What would you have done in Elena's position? Drop it in the comments. Share this with a friend who needs to see it. Thanks for watching.